Good morning, members. Welcome back. We're going to call the meeting back into order, and we do have a quorum, and we'll dispense with the calling of the roll. We were just waiting for a few more of our legislators, but when I saw that Representative Parkinson and still Senator Jim Tracy had made it, I'm sure we had waivers from Senator Henry and Senator McNally to proceed. We're going to take up at tab 5 today. Is there anything for the good of the order beforehand? Anything anybody needs to talk about? Any epiphanies overnight? Okay, we'll wait. Tab 5 on transparency. And you'll recall from the last meeting we had where we talked about transparency, everybody seemed to be pretty pleased with the report as we had it, and so we're going to have a brief presentation here from Ethel today, and it will require our vote on the final report. Ms. Detch, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me?
It is, but doggone it, you have to really talk closely into it there.
We'll try.
That's good.
Here we go.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Tab 5 contains our revised report on government transparency, which I presented at the August meeting. Since that meeting, and in response to some of your feedback, we have made some changes and improvements in it. Overall, we have checked and updated the tables in it. We have added some usage data for the state's open government website, which can be found on page 9. And we've also enhanced some of the information about local government costs and suggestions for reducing them. There are some options throughout the report. We also added the Controller's Transparency and Accountability for Government website as a third open government transparency site hosted by our state government. With that, we seek your approval, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Ms. Detch? All right, there don't appear to be any. Yes, Mayor Bragg, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did you come up with any kind of baseline cost or average cost or somewhere and when you're looking at 95 counties and 136 school systems and 400 Yes. Just give us an idea of cost as we're kind of looking at that.
Okay, I think what we came up with is that the cost is going to vary a great deal depending on what a local government already has in place, what kinds of website it already has or doesn't have. We have some that have no website, so for them it might be a greater expense. We did come up with a whole range of options to kind of minimize the cost that could be. There's a lot of information that's already provided on state websites in different places, MTAS and the Controller's Office and that kind of thing, where you could just provide links and that would improve things. We looked for some cost information, and I've included that in there for some other cities. Most of the cost information we find is from bigger cities and other places, but in general the cost can be minimized, and I think something that also needs to be considered is that in many cases putting information out on the web can actually free up staff time and save money, and some governments have found that they're able to consolidate some functions or contracts or purchases that maybe they hadn't really focused on before, and so there can be some cost savings as well. We don't have a specific it would cost this much for a local government because our local governments are so different in this state.
Chairman Sargent.
Just to follow up on that, was there a fiscal note with the bill?
There was a fiscal note on the bill that was introduced. What we did, though, we concluded that the bill that was introduced was the most complex, complicated, expensive option. So what we did was come up, and it was the actual fiscal note on it, I believe, was about $7 million statewide at that point, but it didn't take into consideration some of the factors that we have identified. And we have also come up with ways that we think governments can improve transparency without going through some of the changes that bill reflected.
Okay, we started at $7 million. Do you remember how much that was for local Was the $7 million basically
Yes,
local?
there are two separate bills. There's a state bill and a local bill. And that was, I believe, the local bill. And let me just verify that, but thank you.
Is the fiscal note in there? On the local bill, do you have what was the original fiscal note on the local bill? Do you know
Estimated one-time expenditures of $7,075,500, annual expenditures of $3,476,000 thereafter.
Okay, and what you did to the bill, would you say it reduced it in half, 75%?
I'm not sure that I looked at it in quite that way, because I think what we did was say that for the very smallest governments, we're not sure they really even need a transparency website, because they have so few people and they still do a lot of things face-to-face that their cost might be zero. They might opt not to do that. And then the biggest governments have already incorporated a lot of this, so their costs might also be very low. So we can't really say for every single one it would be the same.
You know, I hate to pass down $1.5 million cost to local government, because my friend the mayor here told us we took beer money away from them last year, and now we're going to put increased cost on them. So, yeah, we have to be, and I believe in transparency, but on the other hand, I think we got to be real careful on what we're asking local governments to spend.
We agree, and
okay.
I guess we believe that each local government needs to determine what its citizens really want and need. We felt like the bill didn't reflect a lot of things that citizens might want in terms of information about building inspections or other kinds of licenses they may have to find and that kind of thing. We felt like the bills didn't really address transparency maybe in the way that the citizens might want.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Tracy.
Along that line, like you said, a smaller community, for example, is it not required for them to do it? For example, like in Moore County, I mean, they're one of the smaller communities that's in my district. They probably know. How does it work?
What we did, two bills were referred to us. One on state transparency, one on local transparency, and so we started with those, but what we did was look at government transparency as a concept. We looked in other states, we looked at there are 5 or 6 different organizations that promote transparency, so we tried to look at what they get at. And so these two bills that we started with, I guess, would have mandated that every government provide certain things on their websites, but what we've done is gone back and looked at that and tried to talk about transparency, how it could be more transparent, but that there are maybe less drastic ways of accomplishing that.
Thank you.
Now, for your consideration, we can entertain a motion to approve the report subject to further clarification along the lines Chairman Sargent and Mayor Bragg had requested. That would not be a difficult thing to do. Ms. Detch? I
guess for my clarification, if they could actually, is what they're looking for specific estimated costs per local government, or I need clarification on the question.
I don't think so. Mayor Bragg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All I was trying to get an idea if there was a baseline, because I understand there is expense, and obviously 17 counties have got a lot of fiscal capacity, and the 78 counties don't have much fiscal capacity, and that's so. I'm satisfied that we've got enough information in the report, and I think that the report is exactly right. And if there's no other questions, I'll be happy to move that we accept it.
Been properly moved and seconded. Further discussion? Yeah, it's a motion for approval of the report. Yes, Mayor Waters.
Just a comment, I'd like to thank Chairman Sargent for the tenor of his remarks on behalf of local governments. I'm sure as this moves through the legislature, they'll keep in mind the cost to local governments and the fact that I think those of us in local government agree we need some flexibility. Each of us in our communities understand transparency, but there's different levels of that in different communities, so the more flexibility we can have, I think the better off we all are. But I do want to thank Chairman Sargent for his remarks.
All right, if there's nothing further, we'll have a vote. All in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed or abstaining? It's unanimous. Good job. Thank you, Ms. Detch. Thank you very much. Mayor Bragg.
And I'm going to take this report back to our communications department so they can study it and look for those links that will be helpful to our residents and others. And I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, next on our agenda behind tab 6 is Municipal Boundary Changes and Comprehensive Growth Plans, Public Chapter 441. We have before us a draft report for review and comment, and Ms. Eldridge is here with us. Let's see, how do you, you're still standing.
Yep.
This hasn't been tiring or anything, has it?
No, not stressful at all.
That's great. Thank you. Good morning.
Well, thank you, Chairman and Commissioners. Today I'll be presenting the draft version of the report on changes in municipal boundaries and growth plans. You may have noticed that we present no recommendations in this draft report. Instead, we present only the information collected during our research. We look to you today, the Commissioners, for guidance on what recommendations we should make in this report and tell us what changes, if any, should be made. At this point, if we're really looking for guidance and we really don't intend on coming up with our own staff recommendations, we're really looking to you to tell us what we should do. Public Chapter 441 passed in the legislature this year and directed TACIR to review and evaluate the laws governing changes in municipal boundaries, including annexation, de-annexation, city mergers, and mutual adjustment of boundaries, since all these topics were in the law that the Act directed us to study. It also directed TACIR to look at the growth planning law. In addition to Public Chapter 441, the legislature sent several related bills to the Commission for study. These bills focused on more specific topics, including annexation methods, informational meetings before annexations, annexation notice requirements, annexation of agricultural property, and growth plan amendments. Most of the information I will be presenting is what is in the introductory section of the report that summarizes our findings, and this begins on page 4. And I'll be covering a lot of information quickly, so if you follow along, it may be a little bit easier.
And also, again, just in case anybody missed this yesterday, make sure you're working off the document that I'm not sure the date of it, but it was the more recent revised draft. I think everybody, maybe Representative Parkinson needs that so that when we say page 4, we're all on the same page. Excuse me. Thank you.
The issue that seemed to attract the most attention in this session was annexation methods. The coverage of this topic begins on page 5, actually. Before passage of Tennessee's Growth Policy Act, also known as PC 1101, referendums were not required for annexation, but they were authorized. The Act changed that. It required local governments to create growth plans, and 3 types of growth plans are established in the growth. 3 types of areas are established in the growth plans. Urban growth boundaries, also known as UGBs, which are areas outside the corporate limits but contiguous to the cities. Current law allows cities to annex by ordinance or referendum in the UGBs. Planned growth areas, also known as PGAs, which are areas outside the city in the UGBs where new cities can incorporate, and rural areas, also known as RAs, which include areas like agricultural land and wildlife areas. Current law authorizes cities to only annex by referendum in PGAs and RAs. The General Assembly sent the Commission 2 bills for study that would require referendums for annexation. House Bill 590 would require referendums for all annexations in the UGBs. Senate Bill 731 would require referendums for all annexations within the UGBs under an amended growth plan. Tennessee is one of a small handful of states that has few limitations on a city's ability to annex territory without getting consent from voters. This is also known as unilateral annexation. The number of states that allow cities to unilaterally annex new territory without consent have been declining over the years. Most recently, North Carolina, which amended its law in 2011 to require annexation by consent. Concern about annexation by consent or annexation by ordinance in Tennessee has been growing over the years. Some bills calling for the end of annexation by ordinance without consent were introduced before the Growth Policy Act was adopted in 1998, and a number have been introduced since then. You can look at our chart in Appendix C, beginning on page 889, for additional information on these individual bills. And these bills were presented in the docket book at the July meeting. Most state laws require a referendum. Referendums are held in one of three ways. Number one, the most common method is the voters in the territory can vote in the referendum. Number two, voters in the cities and territory can vote in the referendum, but the votes are counted separately. Then you have the third method, voters in the city and the territory can vote, but the votes are counted together. Other states also authorize city to get consent from voters through a petition or mail-in ballot rather than a referendum. There is also a related issue in states that require annexation by consent, the issue of vacant land. Some states authorize property owners who don't reside on the property to vote in the referendums. And of the states that require consent before annexing, 2 specifically address the issue of vacant land. Colorado provides that if the territory is vacant, then an annexation referendum must be held in the adjacent territory. And in Louisiana, allows annexation of vacant property once each non-resident property owner has consented. Rather than requiring an election on the front end, some states authorize residents to petition for a referendum once a city has either passed a resolution initiating annexation, as in Kentucky and Maryland, or the annexation has been approved by a state or local level board, as in Michigan and California. A few states authorize voters or owners to stop annexation if enough voters or owners protest. And some states are actually kind of like hybrid states that authorize unilateral annexation in some circumstances and annexation by consent in others. In addition to annexation by consent and unilateral annexation, there are a few states that require annexations to be approved by a third party, such as a court or state or local level board. A related issue that came up during the study was corridor or strip annexation, and this issue begins on page 6 of the report. One rationale given for annexing by ordinance without consent is the difficulty of reaching owners of non-contiguous property who want to be annexed. Most often the parcels are proposed to be or already being used for commercial or business purposes. The concern here is balancing the economic development interests of the community with the desire of landowners and residents who live or own land between the city limits and the property owner that wants his or her territory to be annexed. Some cities annex narrow strips of land along roads, rivers, or other avenues to reach property that is not contiguous to the corporate boundaries, which is known as corridor strip annexation. There are 2 concerns raised by strip annexation concerns. Number 1, road maintenance, and number 2, emergency response. County highway officials have expressed concern over cities using strip annexation along rights-of-ways in order to establish contiguity. When cities annex a road but not its adjoining property, there is sometimes confusion over who is responsible for maintenance and emergency response. Another concern is that when a city annexes only part of a right-of-way, leaving responsibility for the road or bridge to the county. A number of states prohibit or restrict strip annexation either through case law or explicitly by statute. Although some states allow cities to annex non-contiguous territory under limited circumstances, Tennessee doesn't. Allowing for annexation of some non-contiguous territory may reduce the desire to annex along corridors. 3 states allow the annexation of non-contiguous territory if property owners consent to it. 2 of these states require the property be within 2 or 3 miles of the corporate limits. Kansas requires that the Board of County Commissioners approve the annexation. In Indiana, the property must be used for a business or industrial park. Indiana also authorizes the annexation of non-contiguous city-owned property, as does California and Wisconsin. Plans of service was another issue that the staff looked at during the study. This issue begins on page 6. Current law requires Tennessee cities to provide a plan of services prior to annexing territory by referendum or ordinance. Most other states also require a plan of services prior to annexing territory, and many require budget or financial information to be included in the plan of services. Senate Bill 1054 passed this session, and sections 5 and 6 were taken out of the bill before it passed, and we included these 2 bill sections in our study. These sections would have added some requirements for the plans of services, including requirements that the plan show the standards for delivering the services to the territory proposed to be annexed, and information on the financial ability of the city to provide services to the territory. Another issue that came up during the study was the issue of extending utility lines outside the city limits. This section begins on page 7. Tennessee law allows cities to extend utility lines beyond their corporate limits. Tennessee also requires that the city utilities be self-supporting, funded by ratepayers. Many cities have extended utility lines outside the city to encourage economic development or in anticipation of future annexation. Some local officials are concerned that without the ability to annex by ordinance, cities may not be able to annex areas that are served by their utilities. Local officials have argued that requiring a referendum or annexation could slow economic development and hinder Tennessee's competitiveness. Without the certainty of being able to annex territories, cities may be unwilling to extend services beyond their borders, which may make it difficult to attract business and industry to areas where counties and utility districts are not able to provide services. Idaho has addressed this problem by making consent to annexation implied in an area if the property is connected to a city water or sewer system and if the connection was requested by the owner prior to July 1st, 2008. Next, we'll look at the fiscal impact of annexation, and this section begins on page 37 of the report. Staff looked at the literature on annexation to evaluate the statement that expanding cities' boundaries is essential to economic growth. Case studies of individual cities that have been done in academic literature show that annexation's fiscal effects depend on a number of variables, including the type of annexation, the fiscal analysis method used, the state and local fiscal landscape, and the fiscal position of the community at the time of annexation. Analyses of multiple cities have mixed results, with no conclusive evidence that annexation results in increased efficiency, revenue, wealth, or equity every time. Some of these studies suffer from methodological problems, and many use old data. Moreover, since annexation's effects vary by jurisdiction and depend in part on the revenue streams involved, it is simplistic to assume that the cities always benefit and counties always lose from annexation. Staff also compared each state's economic performance since 2000. We grouped the states by type of annexation method used: consent-only, unilateral, hybrid, none, and third-party approval, and compared the state's performances using growth per capita since 2000 in 4 measures: population, gross domestic product, personal income, and employment. As shown in the charts beginning on page 39, we found no clear indication that the annexation methods available to cities have an effect on economic growth. The charts include one for each measure that compare the states, grouped by annexation type. These show that generally the median rate of growth was similar for each group. The charts also include one for each measure that displays the 50 states by growth quintile, the 10 with the largest growth, the next 10, and the average growth rate for each quintile. Also, each quintile's bar has bands indicating the proportion of that quintile made up of states of the various annexation types. And these charts show a mix of annexation types across the quintiles. Another issue that came up during the study was the hold harmless provision of the Growth Policy Act. And this section begins on page 7 of the report. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm Chairman Sargent.
I have one quick question. Did you listen to the discussion yesterday on water and water rates and sewer rates?
Yes.
It's amazing, these people that live outside the cities. It sounds like I'm a city person. I'm really not. Live outside the city. They want water and sewer. They don't want to be annexed. They want water and sewer. Now they want us to say what the cities can charge for water and sewer. I mean, the whole thought process of where we're going with this, especially on the sewer, what we talked about yesterday, it doesn't make sense if the cities are going to, and then they cannot annex. The people don't want to be annexed, but they want the services of a city.
Yeah.
Is there a conflict there?
It could be. I know some states, cities say they won't provide utility service outside corporate boundaries unless they can annex the property. So I don't.
You just put that on your grocery list of recommendations. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How does a city recoup that investment if they are not able to annex that area?
Well, the law says that the utility has to be self-supporting, so they have to charge enough, I guess, sufficient rates to actually keep the utility afloat, as far as I know. I think we've got the lead researcher on that project here if you would like to ask her some additional questions. I guess she's okay.
Go ahead.
The Growth Policy Act added a new provision to the annexation law that required for 15 years following any annexation, the county is held harmless for the loss of wholesale beer and local option sales tax that would otherwise have gone to the city. The dollar amount for any annexed tax-generating property is referred to as the annexation date revenue. Any increases over this amount are distributed to the annexing city. Some county officials have expressed concern that the sudden loss of these revenues at the end of the 15-year period and would like to see a gradual reduction in the revenue distribution. You can go to page 45 of the report to see a chart showing when the local option sales tax hold harmless payments will be expiring and how much each county will be losing. And we also have a more detailed chart in the appendix as well. Tennessee is the only state that has a hold harmless provision for wholesale beer tax and local option sales tax after annexation. Some states don't even authorize these taxes for local governments. Partly because of a lack of data on retail beer sales in annexed areas, all of the beer wholesale tax has gone to the annexing city since the hold harmless provision went into effect. Recent changes in reporting requirements may make it possible for the Tennessee Department of Revenue to identify beer retailers among a list of annexed businesses. While the department still does not have the retail sales information, they can use the tax ID information to request beer wholesalers selling to these businesses to provide the tax payment information necessary to calculate the hold harmless amounts. The next issue we'll be looking at are informational meetings and public hearings before annexation. This section begins on page 8.
And I heard your statement regarding the counties lose and cities win. The fiscal effect or impact of a city taking over a territory to maintain roads and those kinds of things, were they considered in that calculation? Obviously, from a fiscal note, there may be loss, for instance, of some sales tax. If a sales tax provider is incorporated, as my business was when I moved down to a rural area next to Smyrna on I-24. But the county doesn't have to take care of the roads anymore. The county doesn't have to take care of the ditches anymore. The sheriff doesn't have to respond anymore. I mean, how was that calculated or fitted in, so to speak?
I'd actually like to defer that question to Dr. Cliff Lippard, who actually wrote that section of the report, if he's here. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Member, actually, we didn't specifically look at that factor. We discussed the fact that that's one of the types of factors that the studies look at, and that it varies from locality to locality, depending on which study you look at. Our main point was that there was no real consensus in the literature on the economic effect of annexation, but that it is simplistic to say that cities always win and counties always lose, because there are a number of factors that go in, and it really does vary from location to location. The actual economic measures that we looked at was a much more first look, if you will, basic comparison of economic performance across states based on their annexation method. So it did not go down to that local level and compare the city versus county. It just looked at the overall performance of the state.
Mayor Rowland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Cliff, following through on Mayor Bragg's question, I think another consideration will be fire protection and insurance reduction, usually for those people who are annexed into the city.
Certainly.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything else for Cliff? I know Mayor Beats is thinking about it, but he's going to wait. Thank you. Ms. Eldridge.
Current law requires one public hearing be held before annexation by ordinance or referendum, and no informational meetings are currently required. One of the bills sent to the Commission for Study, Senate Bill 1381, would require 3 informational hearings before annexing by ordinance. An amendment to the bill would have reduced the informational meetings to 1. North Carolina is the only state we found that required an informational meeting prior to annexation, and this is in addition to a public hearing. The next issue we looked at is annexation notice. This section begins on page 8. Current law requires cities to publish notice of all annexations in a newspaper at least 7 days prior to the public hearing. When annexing by referendum, cities must also mail notice to affected property owners at least 14 days before the hearing. 2 bills sent for study focused on the issue of annexation notice. Senate Bill 1381, which would require any city proposing to annex territory within the city's UGB to mail notice to any property owners within that UGB 90 days before the proposed date of annexation. House Bill 590 would also require 90 days notice, and an amendment to that bill would increase the time period to 180 days. In other states, there are generally 3 types of notice that's sent out before annexation. Notice of intent, notice of public hearing, and notice of election. The minimum public notice requirement for intent to annex in other states ranges anywhere from 7 to 30 days. Virginia, for example, requires notice to be sent before instituting annexation proceedings. 8 of these states require notice to be published in a newspaper, and 4 require notice to be sent by mail. The minimum notice requirement required before a public hearing ranges anywhere from 6 to 60 days. 28 states require notice to be published in a newspaper, and 12 require notice by mail. The minimum notice requirement before an election ranges anywhere from 4 to 30 days, and 9 states require notice to be published in a newspaper, and 1 requires notice by mail. Annexation by agricultural land is the next topic we'll look at. This section also begins on page 8. Tennessee has always allowed cities to annex property used for agricultural purposes and allows uses to continue on that property. But Public Chapter 441, which directed TACIR to study changes in municipal boundaries, also placed a temporary moratorium on the annexation of agricultural and residential land without or with the consent of the property owner, or placed a moratorium on annexation of the property, but you had to have the consent of the property owner. This moratorium expires next May. Senate Bill 1316 was sent to the Commission for study and would prohibit annexation of land in UGBs that is zoned for agricultural use until a change in use is triggered by a request for a non-agricultural zoning designation or by sale of the land for a different use. Some cities actually may not even have agricultural zoning designations, so that could be a problem. Only 8 states restrict annexation of agricultural lands. Several prohibit annexation of agricultural land outright. 2 states, Idaho and Ohio, allow owners of annexed agricultural property to request de-annexation. In addition to all these issues, we also plan to add some language on to additional issues. One of these was a concern brought up by the home builders, which was concerned vesting of development rights. They had concerns about property that had not been developed and is in the early stages of development when it is annexed. In some cases, the city does not honor the county requirements for plat approval, or the city may place additional requirements for plat approval that were not in place when the county approved it. This increases the cost for the developer.
Excuse me a moment, Ms. Eldridge. Senator Kyle seeks recognition.
Just very briefly, when agricultural land is annexed, does that affect the green belt standing at all?
I don't think so, no.
So if you're in the green belt and you're not paying taxes, then you're still not paying taxes if you're in the city? I
think the greenbelt designation gives you a break on your taxes.
A break, significant, right. I was just curious whether that affected one thing or the other. Senator Norris would know a lot about that and declare Rule 13.
If we were in court, I'd have objected to the question. But since we're not, I didn't. We pay taxes. We pay taxes. We pay taxes. We're saving you money by farming. Thank you. Proceed.
Those are the only jobs you created this year.
Kyle, you're out of order. Here we go.
We're also going to try to highlight the fact in the report that a few states have somewhat different annexation and planning requirements based on the population of cities or the counties that the cities are in. I know Senator Collett mentioned that we have one law for different types of communities, and a few states have created slightly different annexation and planning laws for different types of cities. Nevada, for example, has somewhat different annexation procedures for cities and counties with a population above 700,000 and those under 700,000. And in that state, comprehensive planning is mandatory in cities with populations over 25,000, but it isn't in cities under 25,000. All of this information is really in the appendix. We're just going to try to pull it out a little bit more. Next, we'll look at de-annexation. This section begins on page 9. In Tennessee, only cities can initiate de-annexation, and there are two de-annexation methods. The first requires the de-annexation to be approved by 3/4 of the voters. The law is vague about whether those in the territory get to vote or all of the voters in the city. The MTAS annexation guide, I believe, says that they believe that all the voters in the city get to vote. The other method allows cities to pass de-annexation ordinances but gives residents in the territory to be de-annexed an opportunity to petition for a vote. If a referendum is held, it must be approved by a majority of those voting. 13 states authorize only property owners to initiate de-annexation, while 9 authorize only cities, and 14 authorize both property owners and cities to initiate. A majority of states require a referendum or consent to complete the de-annexation. Next, we'll look at mutual adjustment of boundaries. This also begins on page 9. Tennessee cities may adjust their mutual boundaries by contract to align them with easements, rights-of-ways, and lot lines so as to avoid confusion and uncertainty about the location of contiguous boundaries or to conform the contiguous boundary to these lines. There is no provision for residents or property owners to participate in these decisions. 10 other states have laws authorizing cities to adjust shared boundaries by mutual agreement. Only Iowa allows mutual adjustment by contract. The other 9 require cities to use their existing annexation and de-annexation procedures to simultaneously annex and de-annex property. Next, we'll look at mergers. This topic begins on page 10. 2 or more contiguous cities located in the same county can merge into one city, and mergers can be initiated either by cities or registered voters in those cities. Regardless of who initiates the merger, it must be approved by majorities of those voting in separate referendums in each of the cities. The majority of cities or states have similar laws, and 33 require a referendum before a merger can be finalized. Next, we'll look at the growth planning law, which Public Chapter 441 also directed the Commission to look at, and this begins on page 10. The Growth Policy Act required each county to establish growth plans. The oldest growth plans are now 13 years old, and most are maps depicting UGBs, PGAs, or RAs. 25 counties' plans have been amended. Amending the plan requires the same process and approvals as the initial plans. A city or county mayor may propose an amendment by filing notice with the county mayor and with each city mayor. Upon receipt of the proposal, the county mayor is required to reconvene the coordinating committee, and the coordinating committee must submit the amended plan to the respective legislative bodies for approval. After approval by the legislative bodies, it goes to the State Local Government Planning Advisory Committee, and once the LGPAC approves it, the amendment becomes part of the county growth plan. One of the reasons given for not revisiting the plans more often is the cumbersome process for changing them. 2 bills referred to TACIR would have changed the process for amending growth plans. Senate Bill 613, which would create a procedure for revising and a procedure for amending growth plans. An amendment of a growth plan would occur when a city mayor proposes a change to the UGB or a county mayor or executive proposes a change to a boundary between a PGA or RA. Only one amendment could be considered at a time, and all other changes would be considered revisions of growth plans. Only a city or county legislative body could request a revision. And the procedures for amending and revising growth plans would be similar to the current procedure, but amendments could only be initiated once every 3 years, while revisions could be initiated every 7 after approval of the plan by LGPAC. Senate Bill 732 would have prohibited a city mayor from serving on county coordinating committees or proposing growth plan amendments if the city has not annexed all territory within its UGB and complied with all plans of services adopted for the annexed territories. Because the plans were required to consider where growth would occur over the first 20 years of the plan, concerns have been raised about the status of the growth plans at the end of the 20 years and whether they should be reviewed or amended periodically. While the plans were based on 20-year growth projections, there is no indication they would expire at the end of that period. The law does not address what happens to the plans at the end of the 20 years, and there is no requirement to revise or update them. A lot has changed since the first plans were adopted. The population projections that were used at that time have changed. Some counties are growing faster than projected, while others are growing more slowly. And plans based on outdated information may not be useful today. Most other states require cities to review or revise their comprehensive plans every 2 to 10 years. But most other states' plans are much more comprehensive than Tennessee's growth plan maps. And looking at laws in other states, we found that Tennessee's growth plans are, they're just not like the comprehensive plans in other states. Right, I'm sorry. Another related issue that arose during the study were concerns about coordinating committees. Local officials and other interests have expressed concern about the composition of the committees. The coordinating committees consist of representatives from the cities and counties, the soil conservation districts, utilities, local education agencies, Chamber of Commerce, and other interests or others representing environmental, construction, and homeowner interests. Some local officials have said they don't want to have to seek approval from other local governments before adjusting their boundaries. Further, farming interests have argued that membership is skewed in favor of cities and counties with multiple cities, and they don't give adequate consideration to the concerns of farmers. In addition to coordinating committees, the Growth Policy Act required counties with growth plans to create joint economic and community development boards, also known as JECDBs. The intent of the boards is to engage in long-term planning, but there is no specific functions for the boards laid out in the law. The boards can define their own function. The makeup of the JECDB is determined by an interlocal agreement, but must, at a minimum, include the county mayor or executive, the city mayor of each city in the county, and one person who owns land classified under the Greenbelt Law. No other state requires local governments to have such boards. It has been suggested that allowing the JECDB to serve as the coordinating committee could streamline the process for amending growth plans. But the JECDBs are not as broadly representative as the coordinating committees. Ensuring adequate representation of all parties currently represented on coordinating committees would require a different makeup for JECDBs. In conclusion, thank you for allowing me to appear before you today to present the draft version of the report. This has truly been a team effort. Almost our entire staff, including Carrie Courtney, who is the lead researcher on the project, Bill Terry, Bob Morio, Chris Aldridge, Michael Mount, David Lewis, Nathan Shaver, Catherine Corley, Stan Shervin, and of course Cliff and our executive director have worked hard to get all this information together. And again, as I stated at the beginning of the presentation, we look to you, the commissioners, for guidance on what recommendations we should make. So thank you again, and can I answer any questions?
Thank you, Ms. Eldridge. Mayor Beats, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Eldridge. I want to talk a little bit about the 15 years hold harmless thing that we talked about there, and I want to make sure that I'm correct again. Only, as of this year, the only counties that will be losing that money were the ones that were annexed in 1998. Is that correct?
I believe 1999.
1999. Well, in your report in Annex D, I think I quickly counted that there were 7 counties that would lose that money next year, and probably a few more in 15, and it goes all the way up till some counties will not lose that money to 2027. And I guess my thought here wasn't putting the 15 years in that law a result of counties wanting to be able to plan for losing that money. And it looks like to me that and I had a previous life in the county, and we had to plan sometimes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ahead of time. It looks like that most of the counties that would lose this money by the whole harmless thing should have been planning. You know, I heard you say that, they're worried about losing that all of a sudden. Well, they've had 15 years to plan for it. Am I right in that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, and I may have some things later on, Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Hope you will. Yes.
Thank you.
Mayor Bragg.
We're all county residents.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I'd like to, Senator Kyle.
apologize for getting here late, Mr. Chairman. I had to work this morning, as opposed to this. What I heard at the last part of the comment, there is precedent for having different annexation procedures based upon population.
Yes.
It's not that common. Matter of fact, it's pretty uncommon, but someone has tried it.
Yes.
Okay. That's the first thing I heard you say. And the second thing is that some of our growth plans are just right on the money in regards to what was going to happen, and some of them aren't even in the same zip code or area code as to what happened.
Yes.
And it would seem to me that we should not be putting a burden on communities where the growth plan has been predictive, if you would, of needs, values, or whatever. Of course, the growth plan may have caused that to have occurred. I don't know enough about that. But on those where the growth plan is not a representation of reality, that is just asking for local conflict. And I don't think that we as a government need to be putting that on our local citizens if we indeed, by holding people to a growth plan that isn't necessarily, for all good reasons, just didn't seem to get there. So that's the two things that I have a takeaway from the presentation and the summary.
And that's one of the topics that occurred to us last fall as we realized we were 13 years into the 20-year, and knowing that there are some areas of the state who are engaged in some introspection, thinking about whether their plan was adequate, whether they might want to change their plan, make it smaller, for example. That's been discussed in Memphis by the city council and others. Sort of got us thinking about, well, where is everybody in the 20-year process here? How are they working? And that's still a part of this. I want to take all specific questions. I have some questions about the economic indicators. We may want to go to the overhead and look at some of that. But before I do, let me sort of set the stage a little bit here. If you look at Public Chapter 441, just to where we are and where we need to be, 441 required us to do 4 things basically by January 14th. And those 4 things are to complete a comprehensive review. That's been done, and to your credit, an evaluation of the efficacy of the policies in Title VI. Submit a written report of your findings. I mean, arguably these 3 out of 4 are being addressed, and you may want to refine what's before us today. But so we've got the review, we've got findings about the efficacy. We have a written report well in hand. It's the 4th element, that the recommendations that remain. And as Ms. Eldridge said, there are no recommendations here. And I appreciate staff's approach to this. You're not dodging it. We're the group that makes the recommendations. So it's incumbent upon us, if we're to make recommendations, as 441 requires, to do so in a timely fashion, so that whatever is reported out of this commission can be received by January 14th. And as a practical matter, that leaves us one more meeting at best in December to either have made recommendations which are in a revised report for us to consider, or to make recommendations at that time. And then staff's going to be hard pressed between that December meeting and January 14th to meet that 4th element of the recommendation. So I'm just saying that we're meeting the spirit as well as the letter of the law. We're well on our way, 3 out of 4 points. And it comes down to the recommendations, and just based on what we have before us today and the report that's been given, you can see probably fertile ground for a dozen recommendations to consider, and pretty discreet and fairly easy to debate, in terms of a number of things. So one of the things we have to think about as we proceed with questions is where we go from here, and how we meet the mandate of 441, and whether whether any additional time or a different timetable might be merited as to specific recommendations. I'm not suggesting the answer to that, but that sort of frames where we are, and we're miles ahead. 3 out of 4 is really good, and you all are doing a great job. Now, I am interested in the economic indicators that you mentioned, and I know you have some slides available, or I think you do.
Yeah, and Cliff will be giving presentations.
Okay. Mr. Lippard, if you'd come back up. Let's just, I want to get these up. And Ms. Eldridge went over the summary in the report. But this sort of drills down a little bit into that topic more specifically, and everybody has copies of the slides now. If you would, take us through these.
Certainly. Let me start by saying what our intent was with this analysis was to just look at the relationship at a 3,000 miles in the air level of the relationship between annexation methods and economic performance at the aggregate statewide level. So it obviously has some limitations. One being it doesn't go down into that sub-state level and look at the differences in different types of community, different sizes of communities, that type of thing. And we did this because the literature was so mixed as to what the economic effects of annexation were. Some studies showed that the annexation methods or the ability to use annexation was a key determinant in the economic performance of a locality, whereas others showed that it didn't make any difference. And so we wanted to at least look at some type of comparison of the economic effects of the methods. We had 4 indicators that we used as measures of economic success, or success, if you will. The first isn't actually an economic measure. It's population growth per capita for 2012, but it's a common measure used to describe the success of a community, though some would argue that population growth isn't always a successful thing. But it is a common measure of a locality's success. And that information was from the U.S. Census Bureau. The other 3 variables we used, indicators we used, were from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We looked at the change in real gross domestic product per capita from 2000 to 2012. And as you know, gross domestic product or GDP is a measure of the total. It's an attempt to measure the total value of the output of either a MSA, a region, a state, or a nation. In this case, we're looking at the GDPs for the state. And when we say real gross domestic product, that's just acknowledging that the numbers are adjusted for inflation across the period. So the numbers in 2000 are comparable to the numbers for 2012. And then the third measure was change in personal income per capita. So how much the constituents, how much they're successful with the economic growth, how much incomes are going up. And then full and part-time employment growth per capita, so how many jobs are being created. You'll note that the last measure, the data was only 2000 to 2011. That was the most current year available. So what we did was we grouped each of the states by the annexation methods that Leah's already described to you, whether or not they're consent-only states, whether they're unilateral states, the 3 hybrid states that she mentioned, states that have no annexation whatsoever, often because there was no area left to annex. And then third-party states, and these are the states where there's a judicial or other review board that reviews the annexation prior to approval. And so we grouped the states into these categories, and then we looked at how they performed for each of the measures. And the first one you see is population growth per capita. And you'll see there's quite a bit of range within the different categories. Consent range from a low of -1% growth. In other words, population shrank to a high of 37% growth. And then it's hard to see on this chart, but the median the medians are actually fairly comparable with the exception of hybrid states, but there are only 3 hybrid states, so it's kind of a very small sample we're looking at there. So what we found was the population growth varied widely for each of the groups of states. The state with the highest growth was a consent state, Nevada, but I would caution you, we're not saying that with this data, we can't say that Nevada grew because it's a consent state. There are other factors, obviously, that go into each of these things. We're just trying to say whether or not you can say conclusively the annexation method proves or disproves, and what we find is that it doesn't in our analysis. It does not prove, and it does not disprove. The hybrid states had the largest value, as I already said, and Tennessee had the largest population growth among the unilateral states with 13% growth. Now, this next chart's kind of fun, and actually, Lanice devised this, where what we did was we broke by the indicator, so in this case for population growth, we broke all 50 states into quintiles or fifths, and it's convenient with 50 states to break it into quintiles because so there's 10 in each quintile, so you're comparing 10 states in each group, and we showed for each of the quintiles what their average percent performance was for the measure, and then this isn't showing up very well with the color bands here, but it is in your report also, starting on page 39, I believe, are the charts. And it shows, so for example, the first quintile, the 10 states that had the highest population growth had about 23% average population growth. But then you can look within the bands and see what the makeup of that band is. So what proportion of those states were consent states, what portion were unilateral annexation states, etc. And what we find is that there's a mix across. It's not like all the consent states are in the top or all the unilateral states are in the top 10. There's a mix across the quintiles. And we did this for each of the other measures. Change in real GDP per capita, again, wide range within some of the bands, but you see if you look at the median or the midpoint, they're very similar across the bands for the measure. Tennessee had the smallest growth among the unilateral states in real GDP per capita, unfortunately. And then looking at the quintile charts for this measure, again, it's spread across the quintile, so there's no clear indicator one way or another. We see the same thing when we look at change in personal income per capita. Tennessee is in the third quintile here, and we had 35% growth, putting us in the middle for this. I'm sorry, I said quintile. Yeah. Tennessee's in the third quintile on this chart. Sorry.
And so the consent states, I mean, you could conclude, do not appear to be hampered. I'm looking at the consent states on personal income growth, for example. The first quintile, 9 consent states there. The majority of them are consent states.
And I would, again, I would caution from reading too much into this one way or another. I think what it shows is that you can't make a claim that it does hamper or that it does contribute to the success or that it precludes the success. There are so many other factors that go into the economic performance.
Tell me about that Rusk report. I'm looking for the reference to it here. David Rusk.
Rusk is a lot of people refer to Rusk when they talk about annexation. Rusk argues primarily that the ability of a central city to annex is a key determinant of its economic performance. He's looking largely at he's looking at large central cities in MSAs, and he's primarily looking at the effect of the spatial ability of the city to annex. So in other words, if the city is hemmed in by other communities, then obviously it has nowhere to grow or not. So it's not as much that he's not specifically looking at the annexation method as compared to, he's looking at the overall ability of the city to annex. There are some concerns, some critiques of Rusk, even though Rusk is a popular reference. Some of the critiques include that the possible chicken and an egg effect. Is the annexation happening because of the economic success, or is the economic success happening because of the annexation? And then there's some critiques of his methodology where the growth, the success he shows is for the MSA. So it's hard to argue that the city is doing better, or at least whether the pre-annexation part of the city is doing better, or if it's doing better because of the part that it already annexed, and would the two be doing? How would they be doing if they were still separate?
Right. Questions for Cliff? Sort of the inconclusive nature of the data really indicates that some of what we hear, you just can't say that the economic growth is inextricably intertwined with the ability to annex.
Yeah. I'm not an economist, but if I were, I would say, it depends.
It depends. Mayor Rowland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me see if I can phrase this exactly as I'd like to present it to you, Cliff. I repeat what I said at the last commission meeting. I never thought I'd defend Chapter 1101 when it was passed. And then all of a sudden we have problems with Chapter 1101. In respect to my friend Judge Carter, Chapter 1101 actually saved Ooltewah from being annexed by the city of Chattanooga. So it worked in that case. I hear rumblings that maybe in Shelby County of Memphis there may have been some annexation problems out there. And because of those two areas, and I've never heard of problems anywhere there, I'm sure there are, but I haven't heard of those other problems and disagreements between cities and counties. Has there been any consideration? I know we have, what's the population, 600,000 as one city in Tennessee. Has there been any consideration of recommending that, say, a city of 165,000 or more be required to have annexation by referendum? Just a thought. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we do present the information from other states for your consideration, showing that that is an approach that some states have taken, where they have divided annexation methods by class, where cities of a certain size can have certain annexation options available to them, where cities of a smaller size may not. So we present that material for you for your consideration. We don't make a recommendation one way or another on that.
Anything further for Cliff at this point? Thank you, sir. All right. Leah, thank you. I don't know if there are any questions for Ms. Eldridge beyond those that have been asked. That's right. Sometimes we formulate those answers by asking questions. What needs to be addressed then are recommendations to be made. And whether we have, and Mayor Beach, do you seek recognition?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. And how we go about making those recommendations and considering what should be included and how we feel about those, and whether we have the sufficient resources of time primarily. Staff's done a great job, but Mayor Beats, I'll yield to you.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Just to kind of follow up a little bit on what my good friend Tom Rowland said, I have been on both sides of annexation and worked through 1101 through the years, and it worked. 1101 with its warts and all, it still is a great piece of legislation, I think, that it was worked on many years by many people, and I understand there's been many efforts to change it since 1998, as Cliff and his group have give us the date on bills that have been passed or been presented but never passed, and a few of them have changed. So I have a fear that if we go to annexation by referendum only, what will we do to the rest of 1101 that was the good thing of bringing people to the table and talking about their issues? So what I would like to see, I guess before our December meeting, if possible, somebody to tell me if there are unintended consequences to 1101 by making annexation by referendum only. I'm not a lawyer, but I can see that there can be real problems. 1101 kind of protects small cities from larger cities. You know, if you go by referendum only, do you have a city that wants to commandeer the whole county? Does that allow them to do it with the proper work? I don't know. I can see that happening. I would just like to know if it could happen, and obviously if it does, I don't want to be a part of changing that. And one other thing, and I'll be quiet, you know, Mr. Larry Waters has been where he's at for years and years, and I won't tell how many, but I always listen when Larry talks. And a little bit earlier this morning, when we were talking, Larry said that it's good for local governments to have flexibility. And I think about that, and since we talked yesterday, one size doesn't fit all for the water thing, and I'm not sure that referendum only fits all of us. I think we need some flexibility, and 1101 kind of controls that flexibility, and I would just appreciate a deeper look at what happens to 1101 if we go down the paths that have been presented before us, either one of them. And my only caution again is, as I said once before, if 1101 is bad, let's fix it. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mayor Beats. And before I recognize others, just personal privilege. I've been impressed, too, that the sentiment seems to have been very supportive of 1101. I've heard Representative Carter talk several times as the House author of Public Chapter 441. And he can speak for himself, but he's very supportive of 1101. And I think it's been good for all of us to see how it has worked well and what we like about it. I do remember personally asking Mr. Edwards probably 2 meetings ago when he testified as one of the authors of 1101 whether the annexation issue was integral or incidental to 1101, and he said incidental. In other words, there are changes that this group could recommend or that the General Assembly could adopt that would not do, or depending on what they are, but not do any harm to 1101, let alone undue harm to it. So that's one of the things that we need to look at, and I know that you know, there are different kinds of annexation by consent. You can limit it to residential, not industrial and ag. And then the cities say, well, but how do we get to that industrial property if we don't take in the subdivision in between? And we heard Ms. Eldridge today talk about those states that allow you to annex property that's not contiguous, and I see Rodney out there who that would sort of alleviate some of the county road folks' concerns about strip annexations that take a narrow strip but not the road and all those things. There are ways to do this. I just think that whatever recommendations TACIR make, and the General Assembly is going to do whatever the General Assembly wants to do. What would be helpful to the General Assembly and I think to TACIR's reputation is if we make recommendations that are meaningful and constructive and help those legislators in their committees to see what, if anything, needs to be done. But I think you're on the verge of you have the ability to successfully make some constructive recommendations here that preserve the integrity of 1101, but give, I think, some additional support to the right of the people to vote on residential annexation. I'm saying too much now, but I think there's a combination here that can work. It's just how we do it and the time constraints involved, whether we can do it within the time constraints. And Mayor Burgess and then Senator Kyle.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of the staff of TACIR for providing a very, very comprehensive and thorough report. Most all of us sitting here are used to trying to absorb a lot of information, but I can just tell you I'm on information overload just by reading this 2 or 3 times now. Saying all that to say, we have a tremendous amount of data here that shows us what other states are doing, and we find many, many differences. in what they're doing with respect to annexation and otherwise in these other states. And if we looked at our 95 counties, we'd find just as many or more differences there. Some of us are growing immensely, some are not growing very much. But I think as we've reviewed and listened to all this stuff, most of us have really, over the last 15 years now, really done really well with the plans that were put in place some 15 years ago or so. And there's only a few problems that have been identified. I really think that we're not really in a position to be so very, very specific and drill down on exactly what we should suggest should be done with respect to annexion or otherwise, because I think it's going to be different in each of our counties. I'd like to maybe suggest that we put forth some effort out of our legislative body that would require a revisit by each of our counties and municipalities therein to revisit their plans, redo them, give them a 2-year time frame to do that, or 5-year, and put some parameters in there that they must address. Annexation, how would they go about that? How would they provide the services, the times that would be, those services would be provided? Would they be by referendum? I think some of these things could be local decisions. Personally, many of them, most of them, and I think they should be. Public hearing requirements, I think we could get a revisit of the coordinating committee definition of membership. I think that's something that might be, clearly should be visited. I'm saying all that to say I think we need to tell our legislative group that we'd like for them, and maybe a recommendation from this group, to identify the 3 or 4 things that would really be important to include in an update of our plans that we've developed in each of our counties, so that we could then have time over a period of time, a reasonable period of time, just like I think we had before when we updated when we put the first plans in place. I think they gave us a time certain that we had to complete that. So again, I think that would be appropriate. So I'm thinking we need a really more time, a broader perspective of this, and really sort of make this a local decision on many of these things. I think as many of those as we can make local decisions on, we should do it, because we're not all going to grow, and we don't have the same needs. We haven't had the same problems. So that's my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mayor Burgess. And Senator Kyle was seeking recognition, then Representative Carter.
I'll yield to Representative Carter. That'd be fine. I'd rather talk after him than before. He might take all my words and turn them around where they're made sense to him and not me.
Representative Carter.
I agree with Mayor Burgess 100%, and the way to accomplish that is referendum. Why spend all this time and all this effort to come up with a complicated plan which is designed to do one thing: not allow the people to vote? You can phrase it any way you want to say, but what you're afraid of is to take that to the people. Now, 1101 is probably the best law I've ever read. I read it before I got here, and I was amazed at the time and the effort that went into it. I don't want to throw it out in any way. All I want to do is change the annexation statute to require it be by referendum. Change nothing else in 1101 unless you want to. The very way we take this and tailor fit it to each community, and exactly what Mayor Burgess says is right. Everyone is different. So let's give everyone in that area, that annexation, the right to rise or fall based on those specific facts. I was amazed when I read 1101 that the people were not included. I come here, I hear the great things 1101 has done by bringing everyone together. Tell me where the citizen, tell me where the voter fits in this. All I want to do is bring the voter into the mix. 1101 has done a great thing. I don't have any problem with that. It did stop Chattanooga from annexing Ooltewah, but it allowed Collegedale to. So I don't know that the goose is any more tender than the gander.
Question, just on that point, excuse me, Representative Carter, but on that point of bringing the people in on the annexation issue, are you referring to in urban growth boundary areas only?
I'm saying anyone that's going to be subject to annexation has a say in whether that is good for them or not. every one of us go to people and look them in the eye and shake them in the hand, shake their hand, and ask them for the right to vote for us. Now, I'm asking you to give those people who you asked to vote, let them have the vote. We asked for it. We should give it.
And I thank you. No. We don't want to get the gavel out here today. Now, by definition, that means in the urban growth areas, because in planned growth areas and rural areas, there is no right to annex. So just to set the stage,
there is a right to annex.
Unless by petition. But now, in the urban growth area, I just want to finish the thought. Are you talking about industrial, agricultural, and residential, or are you focused on residential?
Residential and agriculture is the focus now.
Okay.
And I understand that's complicated, and we need to work on that. But let me correct one thing that maybe you and I are talking about two different things. If you go outside your urban growth boundary now, you can only do so by referendum.
That's my point.
There have been 4 in Tennessee, 3 were successful.
Well, that's my point.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So
I misunderstood.
we're only talking about those UGBs.
That's right. I'm asking to bring the rule inside as well as outside.
Okay, that further refines, further focuses us down, and then as to the complexities of that intervene because of green space or ag between residential and what a municipality may want for industrial, we've heard some alternatives that could be used to address that. For example, you could allow non-contiguous annexation in those circumstances where otherwise appropriate, so that you could jump over that ag land if that were the case and get to it, so you wouldn't be depriving the city of that economic development opportunity. I mean, there are combinations here that work if we have the time for dialogue, is what I'm suggesting. Senator Kyle.
Very briefly, ladies and gentlemen, as I sit across and look across the room to our representatives of Davidson County, many people assert that the part of the great growth of Davidson County and the economic engine Davidson County has become is in part because they don't spend a lot of time on annexation. They've gone to a metropolitan form of government, and the lines were set, and what the case is. Representative Carter makes a point that I think will resonate with the legislature. People should have a right to vote. Now, and we all trust the people to vote because they all voted for us. I mean, if you think about it, virtually everybody here has gotten a majority vote, and therefore the fact that they would elect me proves, in my mind, that they know what they're doing when they're choosing these issues. But I have found that why people vote is not necessarily a uniform reason. There wasn't a uniform reason on why. There are people who voted for me for reason 1. There were people who voted for me for reason 2. There were people who voted for me for reason 3 and voted against me for reason 1. The same will be with annexation. If we think that the populace is going to have a consistent reason for why they voted to be annexed or not, I think we overestimate the mindset of the populace. What I've heard on all this, and I didn't know hardly anything about it, is evidenced by many of the questions I've asked of these last several months. What we're really talking about is economic development and sharing of risk. We're wanting to be able. We have municipalities who want to be able to be an economic engine for their community, and by doing that built an infrastructure, and they want to make sure they get a return back for having done that. Having taken the risk of doing that, it seems to me we want to be able to make sure we get a return for having done it so we can do it again and again and again. We have different types of cities, and just to be real clear, if you go into Shelby County, where Central Norris represents cities where over half the people will live and work in my town. They don't work in the city where they live. They work in the city where they don't live. Now that's different, I think, from some of y'all's cities. I may be wrong. I may be wrong there, but that's different in your suburban area, where communities, when we have I mean, I had a mayor down there say, I want Memphis to leave me alone. And heck, 65% of his people worked in Memphis. Well, we could leave them alone, take those jobs and give them to Memphians. That'd be pretty good. But I don't think that's what he meant by leave me alone. People in bigger cities do take exception. I think take great exception for those who would benefit from the risk the municipal government has taken, the risk the municipal government has taken, the success municipal government has taken, their life is improved, and then don't want to contribute because they don't want to be part of that deal. Now, that to me, the different dynamic, that all goes again to how people would vote. Do we trust people to vote? I think we do trust people to vote, but I think there's got to be parameters as to how you define the question on how you vote and who this applies to and who is done. The last thing I want to see happen is that the socioeconomic issues in Hamilton and Knox and Shelby County drive us to passing a law that hurts the other 92 counties in those cities they're in, because for reasons that don't have anything to do with, well, they indirectly go to equality of life issues, but they don't go to financial quality of life issues. We don't need to be doing something that will hurt folks who are doing just fine because of collateral issues which are just part of our community. And that's my biggest fear. I have more fear about what we're going to do than what I know what to do. I know what I'm not for. I don't know what I can be for. But I do think that I think this commission needs to be aware, and I think the staff of this commission needs to be aware that I believe the sentiment that people get a right to vote. I mean, you can stampede that issue on the floor of the House or the Senate. You just can. And I'd like to see the first senator or House member who stands up and says, "I don't believe people have a right to vote." We'll have I'd have a list of those who I like to get up and say that. You'd be calling me speaker in 2 years if you just want to know the truth. But I'm just saying to you that's a difficult proposition. So I think we have to accept the fact that I think there's going to be that participation. We've got to figure out how to do that without hurting what has been successful. And I would say this, Mr. Chairman, if our staff isn't ready to be able to help us define and crystallize those issues, we don't need to be ready. We don't need to come out on the 14th of January. We need to come out when we got a product that will drive this issue. We want the recommendation of this commission to be what the legislature passes. At least that's why I come down to these meetings. And until we got what we need to have, we don't need to go forward. And they'll wait on us. I mean, we come down here every day. I mean, they'll wait on us. And so let's have the best we have in what we can do. I think we've learned a lot about what other people are doing and whatever the case may be. Thank you, and I'll quit talking.
I appreciate those remarks. I'm sure we all do, Senator Kyle. And I think we're headed in the direction where we can do that. I mean, if you just look back over today's notes, the areas for consideration of recommendations, whether it's population brackets or classification by population, the need to update plans, the question about whether the hold harmless should be phased out at a certain point, whether we allow non-contiguous annexation, whether we require a more specific schedule for the provision of services by municipalities that do annex. That's something that wasn't talked about much this morning, but has been talked about before. Better notice, more informational meetings, all the ag issues and the right to farm. Farm Bureau has been here before and talked about some things they'd like to see addressed. Whether the process should be simplified to revisit growth plans has been mentioned at least every meeting. whether there's a better mechanism to allow the planning commissions to meet and reconsider. What happens at the end of 20 years with the 20-year growth plans? We've talked a little bit here about the composition of the coordinating committee. That goes to the ease or difficulty with which we reconsider these. The joint economic and community development boards, that's an issue that, you know, this most sentiment I've heard is people just soon do away with those, but I don't know that I'm right about that. And all of those things around the right of the people to vote need to be considered, and we need to make recommendations. And I'm sure there's some that I've missed. Mayor Bragg, you recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate your early on support of reviewing 1101. You certainly brought it to bear for all of us to take a look at it. I'm really enamored with Representative Carter, an MTSU graduate who has gone on to bigger and better things. And the interesting thing is he is so capable, but he reminds us how freshmen, young folks who come into an elected body can help us review things that we have done in the past and help us look again at why we did them then and whether they're working and anything else. And that's not to say that he's not absolutely correct in his feeling for his constituents. I'm kind of reminded that 1101 was to put people on notice. And when I think about that, it was possibly that some people in coordinating committees across our state, those who did and those who went on to become metropolitan governments, who couldn't, they decided what they wanted to do, and as Sam Edwards said, it was pretty broadly based. Everybody got a shot at it, and whether we knew it or not, we put people on notice. We don't have any kings in Tennessee. Nobody just passes rules. We work together to pass rules. And in order to work this out, we decided to go to local governments, conservation districts, people that had property, and went to each of the governing bodies and gave them notice. And I'm really reminded, when I look at this, of what happens when somebody wants to get a road built. Now, we know it takes 20 years nowadays to get a road built, but to improve a road, there's a fellow that would come to me and say, and I may have mentioned this before, why do you call it a road improvement? And I say, well, we're going to increase the safety, we're going to increase the capacity, we're going to take care of the drainage, we're going to put in new utilities, and if we can, we're going to put in bike lanes and sidewalks and grass strips and really make it a nice residential road that's safe, that people can walk along the road without being in the road. It's going to be a great road improvement. That's why we call it a road improvement. And a fellow looks at me and he says, it's going to go through my front yard. I don't call that an improvement. And I think this is the crux of what we're seeing here. That is the greater good to try to look at what a road improvement is for the motoring public, is voting individually in the counties that grow and have had some fortune by using 1101, or the larger counties where people have said, we really don't want to be in that larger county because I don't want that name associated with me, or I don't want to take on that risk. So I think the notice part of 1101, the putting people into an understanding mode that they are near a growing city or that they are subject to annexation, and that the city as a whole, not the individual, but the city as a whole will see this as an improvement, I think that's the answer. And how to tell that fella that that road's coming through your front yard and you're going to be compensated for it. In many instances, I believe that city services are just compensation for the amount of dollars paid in property tax. You're already paying sales tax to the city for the most part. You're paying the gas tax, beer tax, all those other taxes for coming into the city. You're already doing that, so you're only paying now for police and fire protection and you're paying for parks and recreation, you're paying for garbage pickup if you offer it. Not all cities do, but I mean, I think that's the crux of the problem. Are we going to let the individual vote on what does or does not help the rest of us that we've decided to work together? And I certainly agree with Representative Carter that that's a tough question. I don't know what the answer of it is. I can tell you in Rutherford County that the thing that concerns me more than anything is that those islands that get surrounded. You've got 240 houses that get surrounded by the city because the city has avoided those houses by going this way. They've avoided it by going this way. The city has avoided it by going that way. And then finally some fellow up here has got 10 acres that he can put 30 houses on. He wants to come in the city. And he closed that loop, didn't he? And so I got this island that's stuck there. And I'm pretty sure that most of those people are not going to vote 51%, 49% to come in the city. Some of them might, but most of them won't because they've already virtually got everything. They've already got all the city streets. They've already got the grocery store. They've already got the gas station that everybody else has provided along with them. And that's the problem that we see here. So I really think our recommendation, and I'm pretty sure there's no sunset part of 1101. I think it's worked. I think it's been very good. I think some of those folks that have had troubles need to go to their elected representatives. I know when we don't want to be annexed, we tell them, no, we don't want to be annexed, and we do everything we can do to keep them out, including a 10-foot strip or a 30-foot strip or whatever else. I had a fella came to me one time who used to be a member of this body, and we took a 10-foot strip down the front of his place so we could get over to somebody else that was contiguous, and we didn't charge him property taxes, but he says, since that 10-foot strip's in the city, I want my garbage picked up in that 10-foot strip. He didn't want to pay property taxes. He didn't want to be in the city, but since we annexed that, he wanted his garbage can to be pulled out that far, if that would be okay, and deliver him the can. He didn't want to have to put his own out there. So, Representative Carter, I really appreciate your efforts. I'm not being facetious. I'm being serious. You've given us an opportunity to look at something that's been the law of the land in Tennessee. I think has been very progressive and has worked across our great state in many, many, many instances. A lot of times it's just best to know what's going to happen in the future, and we've given people that opportunity, and there we are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Greg. Yes, Mayor Rowland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm very much impressed with Senator Kyle. He's on the phone right now, but
he's telling you what to say.
But he made some great points, as many of the contributors in speaking have. I think of Chapter 1101, where cities and counties have come together for the past 13 years or whatever, and they've planned for the future. Many of those plans are in the process of working right now, hopefully to work. Counties and cities both have got in the back of their mind what's going to happen in the future. And they're working toward that end. I would hate to see those plans, both for cities and counties, to be sidetracked. What I would like to see personally, as Mayor Beats said, before we throw the baby out with the water, I'd like to, maybe in December, if there's a consensus, to have some folks present problems with Chapter 1101. I've heard of a couple, and there may be more, and there may be some that are of significant size that we need to look at. But I think before we completely do away with Chapter 1101 and try to circumvent the plans already made by cities and counties, that perhaps we need to identify some problems and correct those problems if possible. And I know Representative Carter, I know exactly how he feels, and I certainly respect his feelings. But we're looking at the state. We're looking at a non-cookie cutter approach to every state and county, every city and county in the state of Tennessee. So I would like to see some of those problems identified. I think it would help this commission to make a better decision on any recommendations that may come further. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mayor Rowland. A number of problems have been discussed, and again, for the record, I haven't heard one time anybody talk about doing away with 1101, so I don't think we need to worry about that. But I'm all for having had this consciousness raising, the opportunity for more focus on particular problems, and maybe one of the ways to address those and surface those would be to ask staff, with you all's input, to have a list of topics for recommendations that we could discuss at the December meeting. In other words, I just rattled off 12 of them here a moment ago. That may be the basis for some discussion. I am intrigued with the concept of a population bracket. It may be that you all have a comfort level to say, you know, when municipalities over 160,000, all those folks are the ones that need to review and update their land use plans before you even get to the issues of annexation. But we do have in 441 that January 14th date. And I think Senator Kyle's correct that the General Assembly, as long as we maintain the status quo in some form or fashion, would probably be happy to have us continue to grind on this and come up with more refined recommendations based on the problems that have been identified. But that would take that would take the General Assembly's acquiescence, if not approval. Representative Carter, your name's been called at least 3 times, and you've been so patient.
Compliment.
What are your thoughts on the timing of this? I mean, January 14th looms large from the standpoint of meaningful recommendations.
Well, I hate to speak like I'm speaking for a movement, so I'm only speaking for myself. I would have no objection to continuing Chapter 441 for another year or two and go into a more full study. There's certainly things about this. No one wants to harm economic development. No one wants to do that. That's why the bill started out and ended up only affecting residential and agricultural property. So I would have no objection to that. Continue asking putting forth a recommendation that we continue the moratorium for an additional year or whatever is taken and study all of it. We've morphed into a redoing 1101, which was never in my mind. I don't see why you fix something that is not broken. My law amended the annexation statute, and that's all it did. I had no desire to get into 1101, but if we need to do that, we can. And Mayor Rowland, if you've ever been to Kingsport, Tennessee, why don't you call your buddy the mayor up there and ask him if he's got problems. I was shown a map up there last week that was drawn where literally the cities were annexing 2 inches of land, going around places that needed services and going into new subdivisions that did not. If you want problems, you'll get covered up with them. There were 67 counties there at a meeting concerned about problems of annexations in their counties, and I'll be happy to put that together and bring that to you. It was interesting that the mayor said that if we changed the law, Kingsport would die. That he can only survive by making that decision. It's a tough decision, but he knows what is best. And that's what we're going to take to the floor of the House this year to decide whether he's right or that the people have a right to decide. I'm scared of any government that's smarter than its citizens it governs.
Senator McNally? He said the magic word. Thank you, Senator McNally. And Mayor Waters, and then Mayor Bridges.
You know, I think that there are a lot of areas of consensus here. I mean, you know, we recognize that we have some areas that we disagree on, but I think we've got a lot of areas that we do agree on. The importance of 1101, the importance of reviewing it, of everybody sitting down and talking, reviewing it, and maintaining 1101, or at least the main parts of it. So I think we've got some areas of agreement. We've got certainly areas of agreement in, I think, economic development, that we need to have some provisions to address economic development and how we provide those services to make sure that continues. So we've got a lot of areas of agreement that I think can be the basis for some good recommendations. Now, obviously, we've got a couple areas where everyone doesn't agree that we'll have to continue to work on, but I think we can hash that out. Just as a side note, everybody's vote is not the same. I live in the city of Gatlinburg, and a few years ago they proposed to annex where I live, and I wrote a letter to the city commission opposing that annexation. My wife wrote one supporting it, and they voted unanimously to annex me. So some people have more influence than others on these issues.
Thank you, Mayor Waters. Mayor.
There's a big difference between the residential and the industrial and commercial development. In our county, we one town, there's 2 nice subdivisions outside the city limits, and they were developed because they were outside the city limits. And we've got 2 now around a 1,000-acre lake that we just opened that are going to be multi-million-dollar developments, and a large part of that is because they're outside of the city limits. And I don't think any of those would have been developed if there had been any thought or threat that at some point in time they were going to be incorporated or annexed in the city limits. And in that regard, annexation would have hurt economic development in our county. And there's got to be a distinction somewhere between the residential and the commercial development at some point, I think, because people within a nice subdivision may have what they want and not need anything that the city has to offer. Because if their wells go bad, they'll be lined up to ask the city to annex them anyway, and they'll do it by request. But otherwise, I don't know that there's any reason to penalize a nice residential development to go 10 miles on the other side to get 100 acres for an industrial park when you can corridor down and get that industrial park and achieve the same end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I would say where we are then is that our next meetings are scheduled for December 4th and 5th. The January 14th deadline is the law, although I detect a sentiment to entertain additional time, and I think that might become clearer on our December 4th meeting. I'd like to suggest that the staff, and we can do some by correspondence in the interim, or if anybody wants to weigh in here today before we leave, give us a list of potential recommendations that could be made. I mean, I can give you 12 right here based on what I've heard. Topic areas, and have that for discussion at our December meeting, and it will become clearer at that time whether we need more time and where everybody thinks that would be well to do, and how we deal with that, with maintenance of the status quo, continuation of the moratorium for some period of time, whatever time that may be, but make that determination at our next meeting, which is scheduled. Otherwise, we'd have to take more dramatic action today, and I don't know that people really have a vision of what needs to be done. Comments on that? I mean, we're set for December 4th and 5th.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir. Mr. Vice Chairman.
I think that's a great idea to maybe mail in or email to staff and to yourself recommendations. I think everybody has an idea. And let's just put these on the table and consider them.
I guess fine, Senator Kyle. Thank you.
Can't beat something with nothing.
Yep.
I mean, that's the way it works up here, at least. I'm not saying I'm trying to beat anything, but I do think we're at the point where if members of this commission think questions should be voted upon, or at least seriously discussed as a recommendation, we go through a series of, this is kind of like the budget. There comes a point in time you can talk about it, but then you got to start voting on it and start defining it, whether you're going to do this or whether you're going to do that. And I think the list of questions members provide the staff will give us an idea as to where we're going. Just, I mean, sometimes you can find out more about where somebody is, not what they tell you they're for, but the questions they ask you. And so I would like to have, before we walk in here, at least a couple of days to know what topics we're going to take up, and therefore people can talk amongst themselves and try to figure where they are and see what we can do.
Yeah, so the main focus will be on what recommendations, if any, need to be made under 441 on this topic when we meet on December 4th. I don't know what else. Yes, but Senator McNally?
Senator Kyle's point, we'll see the list of topics about a week before the meeting.
Yeah, we were talking about 2 weeks before, and you know, back to the transparency issue on the previous report, we can circulate. I mean, I'd recommend it however it's easiest, but you know, if you email in some topics for consideration, you can copy the whole group and let people keep track of it. Mayor Beats.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fairness to the staff, why don't we set a deadline to what the day is that you want our questions and comments and suggestions in to them? I don't think it'd be fair 2 days before for me to send in a request.
Let's let Ms. Patrick look at that and see what she would recommend. I'm thinking, you know, I really am thinking not less than 2 weeks before, but as a practical matter.
2 weeks before when we have to turn them around.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Docket book for the meeting on the 4th and 5th would normally go out on the 20th.
She says the docket book would normally go out on the 20th of November?
Yes. So that gives us about 3 weeks. Depends. The amount of time that we would need would depend on what you expect us to bring back to that meeting. If we're bringing back a list of topics, specific topics, and maybe just rudimentary ideas for options on them, I think we could do that if you gave us 2 weeks before the 20th. So that would be by November 6th, we would need to have all of your ideas in. If you want more than that, I don't think we could do it in that length of time.
It's a start, at least for the next phase. Yes, Mayor Bragg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, this is an important topic. I think there's a lot involved there, and I've been involved in votes where people have been absent because of plans. So I really would like to allow the Commission to determine whether they would like to have everyone's vote recorded, whether they are present at the meeting or not. I think that would be important because we're just as the county officials and others have talked about people not being represented. I think absence at the meeting would be difficult. So I don't know how to accomplish that, but if those who wish to vote and not present could be allowed to have their vote recorded.
Mayor Bragg, to your point, that will be done. And the mechanical question then becomes whether we have the recommendations for discussion at the December 4th meeting or whether we need to vote on them at that point. And that gets up to the issue I raised at the outset. We have the January 14th. I detect a sentiment that if we are making progress in our discussion of recommendations, that one of the recommendations the group makes is that that deadline be extended, and that therefore we would be making progress. So yes, to your point, and yes, we will. It's probably be for discussion and refinement in December, unless there's some that everybody is so, you know, that there's pretty much everybody agrees on, and it's not that difficult. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if we extend our debate and discussion, will the moratorium be extended as well?
That's what I would suggest.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that would be status quo. That would be where we are. Couldn't be done indefinitely, but that would be, it seems to me that would be the prudent way to proceed.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
For what it's worth, one of my senators, Mike Bell, has entered the room, and as I say, for what it's worth.
Oh,
welcome, Senator
worth
Bell.
A great deal. Chairman Bell, happy to have you. Good to see you.
Just wanted to let my mayor know I don't have a committee meeting today. I'm doing office work. And that's
Looking fine.
A little bit embarrassed.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. All right, then. Lanice, do we have anything else to address at this time?
Let's talk about January date.
Well, she wants to talk about January dates, and here's the situation with January to be thinking about, if not setting. We'll be back in session. General Assembly is going to be up here using these committee rooms. So when we start talking about meetings for January, if you're looking at, for example, the end of January, the committee rooms are really only available Thursday afternoons and Fridays, and there are a whole lot of legislators that, anxious to go home. But I mean, that's just the way it is once we get into January. So you had suggested that the last week, I think, in January. We haven't really discussed it, but the 30th and 31st are the last. That's Thursday and Friday.
That will give us time to get a docket book turned around, I think, in a reasonable length of time, and having enough time between the December meeting and the January meeting to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can we consider that, the Thursday, Friday, January 30th, 31st, without objection? Sort of pencil that in. That's the direction we're headed. Okay. Is there anything else for the good of the order at this time? Hearing none, ladies and gentlemen, we will stand adjourned. Thank you. See you December 4th.